Thank you all for coming. This is a paper that is very much a work in progress that we're now revising for submission, so any kind of insights and comments are very much appreciated. And I'll also at the end have some notes of caution when you have papers that are in topics that are very kind of quote-unquote hot. They can get you in trouble. Because they're not as written and polished as a published paper, and people say that you said things that you did not. So that's how it started. So my co-author and I, he's an economist that has interest in institutional, higher education institutional pricing behavior, student choice, student price response, and how this affects revenues, so on and so forth. And I have a profound interest in public universities as bureaucratic agencies that do redistribute a lot of resources through these tuition, which I'll explain later, tuition discounting practices. And I'm also a big believer in how the states organize higher education in different states. Their governance structures have a great deal to explain what goes on at the institutional level, and so we have a multi-level problem. So we got together, pulled our strengths, and I have two papers. This is the first. The second, we look at different responses to different kinds of student aid, and we're also looking into working on a project trying to measure state oversight, financial oversight of higher education institutions. So the general context and motivation obviously is the changing landscape of higher education finance. I don't need to tell anybody about that, especially in the publics, but certainly in the privates with the need for fundraising, what we call cost disease in higher education, where beyond other factors, for example, big dorms and facilities, higher education is becoming more and more expensive as an industry by itself, just like others that are very highly dependent on specialized labor and highly educated labor. So we have decreased state appropriations as a share of institutional revenues that are leading to increases in tuition. States have also, in order to compensate for that, like the purchasing power of the Pell Grant, which is the need-based grant aid program from the federal government, is not as, does not support low-income students as in the past. So states have created, besides need-based grant programs, also merit-based grant programs to help students stay in the state but also go to higher education. There has been an increased use of institutional aid in the publics, and I'll speak a lot about that. Institutional aid traditionally has been used quite a bit in the privates, the discounting and price discrimination, but that has become the survival mechanism for public universities, and hence the resulting increase in tuition levels in real terms. So another thing that motivates us is that there are so many pieces going on at the same time. There's incredible complexity in these grants coming from different sources, different levels of government, cost-sharing arrangements that vary a great deal across states. So it's very hard to understand how these interactions lead to a particular net price for a particular type of student. And what I say by net price is what students pay out of pocket after all public subsidies and institutional subsidies are factored in. So I love this little picture. That's pretty much what, to a certain extent, what we're doing in public universities and in the private as well. You transfer resources from full-paying students to low-income students, and you also redistribute resources to different functions in order to fund financial aid. So as a political economist interested in public agencies, I obviously chose higher education as my focus because what I call them, they're unique. And I'll explain why. Unique in various ways. They have incredible discretionary power over the allocation of public subsidies, because a lot of what goes in resource allocation inside universities in a variety of states is not overseen. After the money is allocated, it does not have state oversight. Some states do, others don't. And there's a growing mismatch between the intended and actual beneficiaries of subsidies, and I'll speak a little bit about that, related to the fact that universities may have different preferences than what state governments and the federal government do. So why are they unique? They can't deny service based on individual academic characteristics and other subjective personal characteristics. So unlike a lot of other public agencies, we can, based on merit and other combinations, decide if a person can have access or not. It depends on the person being prepared for college level work. But also universities have their own ideas about what is the class that they want to craft. So that alone makes it for a very different kind of publications because they can regulate and put barriers to entry for students. What we call in the literature pursuit of excellence. You know, we are at USC, and that's the word of the day that universities are pursuing. Obviously, U.S. News and World Report has created some changes there, but we want to do research, we want to get grants, we want to be perceived as prestigious, and that often does not match with the goals of states and the federal government for higher education. And obviously, depending on the level of research universities, obviously it varies across different types of institutions, so the more prestigious the university is, the larger the mismatch may turn out to be.
So just on the point about the uniqueness in your first bullet, so how is it different than any agency that gives out a formula grant? So there are certain things that they can deny on the basis of specified criteria.
Well, I think it is quite different. Well, first because it's a very dynamic process when admissions offices are deciding who is coming in, right? So while universities may be saying, we want a class that is diverse in a certain way, but they're also taking into consideration students' ability to pay, they're looking at SAT scores. So it's more of an art than following regulations. So
is it closer to prosecutorial discretion?
Probably.
I mean, there's a big literature in bureaucratic politics about that.
Yeah.
Sandy Gordon et al.
Yeah. So basically, it is not as, let's just say that it's not as tied to particular, after you set the path in particular regulations, you have to follow them, right? In most bureaucratic agencies, here is a highly subjective process that universities take into consideration. Students are also inputs. So what I mean by that is if higher education, you become more prestigious if the students that you have are good students because they're peer effects. And students are also contributing to that process. So in order to admit them, you want students that will then feed into your desire to become more prestigious. So they are also not only consumers, not only coming to learn and be educated, but they're also inputs in the industry. As I said, and we'll explain later more, complex cost-sharing arrangements. So states vary a great deal on how much it costs to educate what we call a full-time equivalent student, how much of the subsidies come from the public sector and which level of a public sector, and also how much is coming from the institution itself and how much is coming from students and their families. Can charge for services and practice price discrimination. So when we talk about the drop in appropriations, one of the reasons that has been alluded in the literature is that because they say, well, public universities can charge people a lot more, and they could pay a lot more. Higher education is more of a private good. I don't want to go into the debates about that. But the reality is that say, okay, you have a escape valve. You can charge tuition and then create these redistributive mechanisms, so it's easier to cut higher education. And as I said, the price discrimination that has been common in the privates is becoming a lot more common in the publics. So when I talk about this, I know it's a little small, but it basically shows a snapshot of the United States. The total here is how much it costs to educate. It's average education-related expenses per FTE student, full-time equivalent. So basically, the states vary a great deal in how much it costs for them in terms of the educational expenses, because obviously we do a lot more things, but it's just education and related expenses. It varies a great deal how much it costs in each state, which there's a long literature debates on that. But what I want to point out, this net tuition portion is the part that comes from private sources, students and their families. So as you can see, the composition of the student cost vary a great deal across states, and some states, as a share of the expenditures, are giving more or less public subsidies. So I think that's a good view of what goes on and the kind of differences that we can observe that have a variety of explanations, and also influences what happened at the institutional level. So the cost here is the average education and related expenditures per full-time equivalent student. Net tuition is the share of costs covered by tuition. And average subsidy is the share of costs covered by public resources. So this is what the graph is saying. Well, there's a lot of difference across sectors as well. So here you see the private research universities, the average education-related costs per FTE students. That's the expenditure per FTE student, and the enrollment. So you spend all this money and enroll this amount. And then you go to the public community colleges, that's what we spend, and that's how many people are in there. So you see, we gotta really think about, that's what I find interesting when I read the Chronicle of Higher Education. People don't take into consideration, well, it didn't change that much, how much, community colleges have been protected quite a bit in their overall state support, but a lot more people are going. So basically, you guys are in a good place here.
When you say public subsidy, does that include endowment and gifts to the public university?
No.
No.
No. Government.
Just the government payment?
Yeah.
So endowment and gifts might, and overhead and all that might affect.
Yes. Yes.
But that's not here.
No, not here.
It's in the model.
It's in my
It's in
model.
the model.
All right, fine.
All right, and finally, the student share of cost is increasing. So basically what I'm talking about here today of the links of state aid and tuition pricing is a big part of the story, is that tuition discounting is becoming more prevalent because you have a lot more money on the table from students to play with and redistribute, across. So you have research universities here. These are all publics and community colleges. Obviously, if you're a private university, there's a lot less concern about how this is done because obviously it's private money, but in the publics, the debate is raging on this, and then I'll talk about how it turned out for us. So basically, from '98 to 2008, students are paying a lot more of the share of the cost of let's see, price discrimination. So it's like an airplane, right? You charge different prices for similar students, and the reasons for that can go from personal characteristics, SAT scores, and more these days, being able to pay a larger share of the sticker price to be able to help universities close the books. So what are they doing? Recruitment, as a recruitment strategy. You want to fill all your seats. You want certain kinds of students to come, so you say, I'll give you a discount X in order to try to lure the student. Revenue generation, right? You want to fill in your spots, but you also want to maximize those that will bring, more tuition revenue. And leveraging federal and state student aid resources, that's the key part here. If a student already has a Pell Grant and a Cal Grant, they are low-income students, they qualify for those, it may be, not always, but it may be the case that it crowds out any institutional aid that student might have gotten up to the point where the tuition is fully covered. So that's something that institutions are doing as well. How is it funded? Through foregone revenues. So basically, you give up the revenue, or other institutional sources. So they could be from the pot of tuition, but also from endowments and gifts, and what we call revenue goods in universities, where you have the food court, you bring the franchises, you make money, housing. So the auxiliary enterprises can also generate money that can subsidize. Universities have different strategies here, but a lot comes from foregone revenues and tuition revenues. And higher tuition. So you basically try to calculate, if you raise price a little bit, what kind of impact you're going to have in terms of the class that you're going to come, how many students are you turning away, and what's the impact on overall revenues. There's some recent research out there saying that in the publics, apparently when you get to 13% of discounts that you start giving people, it starts being decreasing returns. It starts affecting your overall revenues. So I'll give you a little background. What's the Bennett Hypothesis? That's the core of our paper, right? If anything, increases in financial aid in recent years have enabled, if anything, colleges and universities to raise their tuitions, confident that federal loan subsidies would help cushion the increase. So this is former Secretary of Education William Bennett in 1987, and it has been the idea, it pops up often, that if you increase financial aid, institutions will capture the rents and basically tuition will go up. So we're in the same place. So that's the idea, right? That would be predicted by economic theory. So we're asking, so do institutional prices increase as a result of increased state student aid? So that's why we call it the Bennett Hypothesis. So is that true? So one of the arguments against increasing financial aid, including the Pell Grant, is that because institutions are strapped for money, they will be capturing some of that.
That's like the research, that overhead is sometimes used to support education, to keep the university going. It's the same argument about overhead. That if you can get more overhead, you may in fact increase,
So let me clarify here. We think, and that's the argument that I'm going to make, I guess, in a couple slides, that this happens sometimes, not all the times. And the reason for that is the way that we have the governance of universities in a particular state and how institutions are organized. Okay, so this may or may not happen, and sometimes it does happen, not because the universities are capturing rents, but because they're strapped for resources and they find other ways to carry out the educational functions that you're just mentioning. So if the institutions simply capture the rents, right, that's what would happen if the Bennett Hypothesis was true. And there's a large literature has tried to, and there are mixed findings here. So do higher education institutions adjust their net price, which is, again, what students actually pay out of pocket when states alter their financial aid policy? Well, scholars have mostly focused on federal financial aid, not much on state. And state financial aid, student aid has increased a great deal for the past 15 years, especially the types of aid, merit and need-based. We differentiate between list tuition and institutional aid. So a lot of the work has looked at the sticker price. And we also look at net price, basically looking at how much, and also how much institutional aid is being allocated to students. So our institutional response is conditional upon state governance structures. So the bureaucratic agents that oversee higher education decide, in some cases, tuition and programs, set up regulatory environments, and definitely affect, they have market conditioning effects, right, in the states. So there's, I cite a couple of articles here, Bob Lowry and Bridget Terry Long of Harvard University. They find the state oversight of higher education institutions, which is not a surprise, obviously, to any of you, but it hadn't been explored before, especially in the context of the Bennett Hypothesis. So just as a background, the governing structures for higher education, public higher education in the United States, comes from what we call governing boards, coordinating boards, and planning authorities. And that goes from more centralized oversight and control to less, right? So basically, they have different functions, there's great variability across states, but I think the key issue here is to talk about that. One, you have a more centralized agency, where the other, you have a much more decentralized system where institutions have more autonomy. So our theoretical argument comes from principal agent theory, that state governments and higher education institutions often have different preferences than, and as I said, it varies depending on the type of institution, so you have a mismatch here. The amount of oversight will matter then to see what happens eventually in terms of pricing, what kind of students are admitted to institutions of higher education. That I just said. So our first hypothesis is that we're working, that we'll explain later, turn out to be different. That with more centralized governance structures, we have more political control, we have lower public university prices with increasing state student aid. So basically, you get student aids, you have more resources coming in, so that would be what, that they could charge less, right, overall. That would be the idea. Yes.
So are you assuming that the preferences of the state legislature in this case would be to lower the tuition?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That might be kind of a big assumption.
Well, I mean, the biggest concerns they have these days are affordability, right?
That's a different kind of story, right? There's some models. So there are two things that are going on here. One is in terms of the body of literature that you're drawing from. One is that it's sort of a double-edged sword. There's a argument by my team that it's sort of a double-edged sword to use bureaucratic or to use financing to control bureaucracies, right?
Okay.
If you decrease the amount of financing, you also decrease the production of the services that you want. And the other one is this sort of Nolan McCarty argument that there's this sort of exchange relationship between the legislature and the bureau in this case. So basically, you might give up certain types of control, right, as just sort of an exchange to get the policy that you really want. And if affordability is a package of things, not just tuition revenues, the complications in there might not be. It might not give you quite as clear-cut a hypothesis.
I would say one thing. At the end, I'm going to talk about like where I'm going to go with this, which obviously our model does not have a lot of political variables, which is something that you were alluding to. But also, from my knowledge, right, what happens, and that goes also to the political science literature, whether people are paying attention. If they pay attention to higher education at all, is about tuition. So legislators are really, really care. Really care about, especially changes over time for tuition. And in my work, I have made the case when people use citizen ideology as a variable to try to explain, I say, I don't think it's meaningful. It's all at the legislative level. So they really care about that, right? So, and the other part is, universities would rather have lower tuition and get more money from the state, right? So it's not, but if we can't, then we raise tuition. So that's kind of the. Yes.
So you mentioned centralized governance structure. Are you referring to the general governance structure or the specific oversight mechanism for higher education? Which one you refer to?
The governance at the state level. So
for overseeing higher education
exactly.
in particular. So what would be an example of a more centralized structure?
Well, for example, and Tony maybe can speak about that. Georgia is a state that has it's a central governing board for higher education. So nothing happens in the state of Georgia higher education, tuition, curriculum or program development without going through that agency. Whereas in California, we had a planning agency, the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, that now doesn't even exist anymore because the state does not have money to maintain it. So basically, we do not have that at all. So it all happens in the relationship between the legislature and the three levels of institutions. So that's kind of what I
think it's helpful because you still have the Board of Regents, right? You still have things like the Board of Visitors in Virginia. What are those in this structure? I don't understand what.
Well, some states, like Virginia, for example, they may have kind of counseling bodies or advisory bodies, but in this case, I'm not sure about Virginia right now. I'm more familiar with.
The Board of Visitors was not an advisory body. I mean, they actually had ultimate.
But
they approved tenure decisions, and they.
Oh, but that's at the institutional boards then.
Yeah,
you're talking about the institution. Yes. So no, I'm talking about state level structures. So another point that I'm also going to make again that I'm trying to incorporate institutional level centralization and decentralization.
These were not people who were appointed out of the university. These were people who were appointed by the governor.
That is also another important point. That institutional boards sometimes have political appointees and sometimes they don't. Yeah.
And that actually strengthens your argument.
So I think that the level of centralization, decentralization was something I'm thinking a lot about right now. Will have a great deal to do with what's going on at the institutional boards. Yes, there are a lot of interaction effects going on.
You might have two examples in mind that would be useful. One is Michigan, where the money, they ran out of money in the 80s, and essentially it became a private institute. And I don't know what happened there. We must know what happened.
Well, basically the University of Michigan, the last time I heard, about 7% of their revenues come from the state.
Right, it's like Harvard's endowment.
Exactly, yes, and those are used for educational.
So the fascinating thing is that you have a wonderful place to study a very dramatic transition over a short period of time.
Yes, and there's a great amount of literature on reforms, and the tendency right now is towards decentralization.
This one?
Decentralization of
No,
governance
you shouldn't be able
structures.
to use a state like Michigan to study some of your issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
And another one, by the way, is places like Yale, I know, and Harvard, this is from Carol's book, worry terribly much in admissions about who will do the full-fledged players in the 50s and 60s because of these questions. They had exactly the same issues that they're talking about now.
Mm-hmm.
Because at Yale in particular, I read, would we get enough revenue from our full-fledged or not?
Oh, that's gone. Yeah, they do not worry about that anymore.
No, but I'm saying, what I'm trying to do, I know that, but I'm saying historically, there are some interesting examples that may be illuminating.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm trying to think of comparatives, that's all.
That's a larger point that I'm going to make at the end. I think because of what's going on, we're starting to look very much like the private not-for-profit institutions, the publics, and with different levels of accountability, demands, and resources available to us. So that's, it's a ticking time bomb, right? Like that is. So anyway, so let's bear here with me. We're in a private university, private not-for-profit, that we increase net price and cross-subsidize students and other institutional activities with increases in state student aid. So that's the general Bennett argument. So we started with those hypotheses, right, to see what happened. Our sample and data sources is institutional and state data. I won't go into a lot of details. This integrated post-secondary education data system is all the universe of institutions that receive financial aid money from the federal government. So it's quite a bit as a share of overall universe of institutions of higher education. The student financial aid survey, so that tells us how much each state is spending on student aid each year. This is from the Education Commission of the states and the Southern Regional Education Commission that talks about our governance structures. That's where we get our data to code for the governing structures. Time frame 2002 to 2008. We're working now that the data is available to extend that to 2010. We have 539 and then 664, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. It depends on the estimation methods that we're using and the kind of how we're splitting our sample. And then private four-year institutions, not for profit. So this is our empirical model. We're assuming net price equal to tuitions plus fees minus institutional grants. We use institutional fixed effects. So here what I'm going to do is talk about our main results, the main take-home message, and I have a bunch of slides about the econometrics of it. So if there is any interest in the end, we can talk about it. So we control for time invariant heterogeneity. Key controls that we have is institutional revenues from other sources beyond. We have appropriations, gifts, investment income, total institutional enrollment, median family income in the state, and population 18 to 24, which would be the demand for college education. So some of the key controls that we put in the model. We did just fixed effects estimation, panel data, but I find that the most interesting results, given the high levels of endogeneity, would be with instrumental variables. Because state financial aid awards may depend on institutional pricing strategies, right? So states may decide how much they're going to give in financial aid depending on how much tuition is, right? So there is a great level of possibility and of endogeneity here. So we try state general tax revenues. A reviewer in a journal did not like that, and any other suggestions that. So why did we choose that one? It was the best that we could find that would, it's only related to institutional pricing behaviors, right, through state appropriations to institutions. So it's not directly related to tuition setting and price setting. So that's what we thought would be a good instrument for our case. We also tried state lottery revenues, but not all states have lotteries, and it's not that big a share of revenues for institutions, so we stuck with the first one. So any help in thinking about this would be appreciated. So here's the key results, right? Basically, we find that for the dependent variable net price, the increase in state aid, right, have a negative effect and significant for public institutions, a negative effect for list tuition, and no effect for institutional aid. So what we were just here, institutional grant, right? So basically, in terms of the privates, is the expected effect. Well, actually not, right? We didn't find any of these effects that we expected in terms of the Bennett hypothesis, at least in this setting, with the full data together, right? All of them, public and private, in the same sample. So that's what. Do I need to explain the? Okay, all right.
I mean, it's fine with me.
All right, okay. No, because it's interesting. No, let me tell you a story. I told my co-author, I said, I want us to have this, in this time in the paper. He's like, oh, economists don't do that. It's just a political science thing, he said. That's what I heard. And I was like, okay, we like pictures. So, yes.
So you're putting all private universities together. And so did you have any variables that differentiate competitive privates from non-competitive?
Yeah, model in terms of prestige, you mean, like the prestige type of controls?
Yeah, admission,
yes.
admission rate, that kind of stuff.
Yes,
And
yes.
when you that didn't, there was no.
But I think it's because we're looking at it all together,
Uh-huh.
right? And we're using fixed effects. So, if there was something, hence the need to kind of refine our analysis, right? So does governance matter? Well, we split the sample to see between the publics and the privates to see what was going on. Consolidated governing boards, which get a one code, is 24 states. And then coordinating and planning boards, 26 states. So we went after it. And this is what we got. That for net price, there is an effect for strong governance states. So basically, if it's centralized governance structures, you have a negative, you have a positive effect, and with state aid. So no effect with list tuition, and negative in weak governance states. So list tuition is in-state tuition for the public. So here we're looking at the public institutions. We took away the privates. So basically we have institutional grants. So is there a change in how institutional grant, how much is allocated, et cetera, if you increase state aid? If there is a change in in-state tuition, which is the sticker price, or the net price. So basically how much students are paying. So basically you increase state aid, net price increase almost 1-to-1. So that's what we're finding, right? But only in consolidated governance states. So that goes against our expectations. So what we think could be going on and are still exploring is that when you have decentralized governance structures, then institutions are competing for the students, right? For that financial aid money. And that could be one of the reasons that net price goes down.
When you say consolidated versus coordinating, can you just reframe that? Because I'm not a specialist.
Okay, so consolidated is more centralized.
Okay.
And coordinating is decentralized.
And so your University of California example was the coordinating, and the consolidated was
Yes.
Georgia.
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 All right.
Yes. And Michigan is
A mess.
coordinating. Yeah. So discussion. We kind of find that for public institutions, it's counter to benefit when we have decentralized governance structures, right? Overall, there's a net decrease in price if we increase state aid. Negative tuition effects. So if we increase state aid, overall tuitions are going down. Only in institutions with weak governance states. So as I said, our working hypothesis right now is that states that have a decentralized structure like we have are competing for the student aid that is now in the hands of the students through state aid. So that could be the case that they're basically discounting it more to bring those revenues in. So that's counter to what we expected early on. Yes.
To what extent that would be co-varying with the economic situation, right? I mean, if you have an economic downturn, probably the university would feel kind of less able to increase tuition, and then the state government funding source might be diminished as well. I don't know whether that would be
we
kind of
have
confounding
state median
effect.
income as a control, but you're right, maybe unemployment would be a better, more refined control in this case, to take a look. But we're also controlling for state appropriations, which basically accounts for what the impact of the economy we've had on the amount of money that institutions receive from the state government. Small positive effects on institutional aid. So basically, if you have more, but stronger in weak governance states, or what we say decentralized states. And the evidence indicates that institutions may work with state financial aid goals overall, right? So we were expecting, actually, well, we had an theoretical expectation based and had the motivation coming from the Bennett hypothesis, but it seems that at least our expectation that governance matters, it's playing out as that it does, but in a different direction.
So the consolidated governing boards, are these independent are they created as independent agencies?
In some states, they're more independent than in others.
Right, and that's an important part of, I mean, you've got a 0-1 here,
Yes.
right? But essentially, the argument would be that you would expect, if the politicians want to commit to lower tuition and more financial aid, right, those two things, you would expect that effect to be positive, and it is, right? But it's not uniformly positive, because now the politicians aren't going to manipulate the tuition, they're going to commit to that policy, and that's what the consolidated review boards are going to do. The coordinating boards, though, why does the commitment drop with coordinating boards? What's the institutional story there?
Well, at this point, and as I said, we basically gave a first try on this literature, right? And the literature that looks at this from the economics of higher education basically just says, centralized and decentralized. Now, that's what I'm bringing to this piece, is started to ask the questions that you're just asking, right? The problem that we've had is that we don't have better indicators for that.
But I mean, even just in terms of the two, the choice that you have.
So isn't it though that in a lot of the consolidated, they actually have to approve the tuition increases?
Yes.
Whereas in coordinating, the individual institutions have more flexibility in
So
setting.
as we speak, we have some student coding tuition setting authority.
Because that seems to me the elephant in the room.
In different states, yes.
Whether they have the leeway to actually
Exactly.
change their tuition.
Exactly.
Well, even in terms of the 0-1, I mean, it could be, I mean, is it just that you're saying that a veto player is the, I mean, if you have an actual veto player, you get the commitment, if you don't, you don't?
Well, in the case of higher education, that's an interesting question, because it could be either way, right? Universities, if they have 1 point, right, they have 1 point to go to lobby for more resources and results there and outcomes that are more desirable to the universities. Conversely, it could be the case that the legislature has more power and oversight to get the inverse results. So that's still an empirical question that is out there, which I hope to be able to address in future research. So,
I wonder, those governing boards, so would they differ in terms of maybe they were controlling the public universities more and less so for private? So would there be variations in terms of, since those boards, I would assume they were
only for the publics, yeah.
mostly for the public.
Yes.
So would there be states that would have some degree of oversight of private universities? It wouldn't be the case.
Well, they do, but not on financial aid matters. They usually do that on kind of bully pulpit type of thing. You have a big endowment, what are you doing with it? Like, why are you not spending more on low-income students, so on and so forth. So there's an indication for Bennett, but I wouldn't, yet commit to it. So overall positive and insignificant net pricing effect. State governance structure matters. Public institutions in states with strong governance structures have small responses to state financial aid. So basically we saw the larger responses in those that do not have strong governance structures. And they even may behave as described by Bennett, but that's our next step. And they have strong responses to state financial aid. And if we'd expect the argument that there's market mechanisms going on, then it's a solid story. And that would be counter to Bennett, which is what we expected in the first place with the principal agent model, right? So our next steps. So again, a more complex discussion and creation of indicators and reflection on the state governance structures. There's a lot of qualitative data on very good discussions of descriptions of how they work. It's just a lot of information. They deal with a lot of dimensions of what happens in higher education, so we need to kind of sort through that. We're also working on pursuing indicators of state financial oversight. So only the ability to set tuition is not enough. I think there's a lot of informal things that go on, and I was talking to Tony earlier about that, where even if you do not have the formal ability to set tuition, there are informal mechanisms that states and higher education institutions play this game, how much they're going to charge. Indicators of various dimensions of university autonomy, and in that case, goes beyond finances, but also regulation, who gets in, affirmative action, all these things that we talk about in terms of state-level higher education policy. And then again, higher education systems and institutional boards. So bring the institutional board level governance and how they're politically appointed or not, and to bear in this question. And finally, do institutions reallocate resources from other essential functions to fund financial aid? That's another elephant in the room. So let's see if I would say it again. I think that's an important question that we hope to look at. So the funny part, a note of caution, that was the headline on the Chronicle: State student aid policies drive college prices, researchers say. And we got a lot of angry emails that we were saying that if states increase student aid for low-income students, that tuition is going up everywhere, and that's what it went. So I have a link here. Then the Institute for College Access and Success, which is a left-leaning think tank up in Oakland. Although the study shows a relationship between average state need-based grants and college's net price, there's a little evidence of the discussion of causality. Well, we didn't even go there, right? But so they basically went after saying that student aid was a great thing, which I believe it is. Just it depends, right? It depends on the design of the higher education system, who are the students that are coming in, the political environment, so all these questions that we hope to address. And then the last one is in the Senate Judiciary Committee this past March, we were cited. It is, of course, difficult to conclude definitively from simple aid and price comparisons that aid fuels price increases, but a growing body of research controlling for variables outside of aid supports the hypothesis that aid has an inflationary effect, though study results vary by type of aid and institution. That's a good one. So we were in a brief. I like it because, yeah, it depends, right? It depends here.
But you have that sentence that the congressman will fall.
Yes, they're not going to pay attention.
Right.
And our political science friends here is going to say, they're not going to pay attention to this, they're going to pay attention to this, right? That's what happens. And the final one, same, he's from the Cato Institute. That sure as heck does not mean, though, that there isn't any research showing government aid drive price inflation, even if it doesn't prove it. In addition to the incredibly powerful rational reasons for strongly suspect aid plays a big role in out-of-control college pricing, there is indeed empirical evidence. For the benefit of the whole debate, I offer a smattering of it below, hopefully putting an end to the disturbing denial tactic employed by Hartle, which is the BVP of the American Council of Education. So it's a conference paper, right? And all those of you that read it, we're still working on it. But be careful for those graduate students in the audience when you're doing these things that you can get caught in the crosshairs. And we're basically saying, well, yes, it may happen. It's, there are market forces here. Institutions are strapped for resources, but it does not always happen, right? Then it's a political economy question. And that's the one that we're hope to pursue in the near future in this paper and follow-up ones. So thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
So, questions?
If I go to, say, Berkeley, right?
Uh-huh.
And I pay whatever the full freight they charge me, that's not the right.
Mm-hmm.
What fraction of the total cost of educating me am I paying?
About half
About half.
today, yeah.
So floating around in this whole price business is the actual cost, right?
Yes.
So when you get subsidies, they have some effect, but you have this massive overhang of the actual costs, which you can decide how much you allocate towards the student pay, right? So it's a very interesting problem because they're playing with a little bit of the subsidy, but the major subsidy is actually
Yes, and,
right.
and in the public universities is coming from state appropriations, right? And,
okay.
and here is from endowments.
Right.
And
gifts and whatnot, right?
Yes.
And overhead. So one of the interesting things I think you want to emphasize
okay.
is that while there's this wonderful discussion a la Bill Bennett, whom I don't think knows much about any of this stuff, I know him before he was anybody, is that the big thing that's going on here is you have this big overhang, all right? It would be as if you were trying to understand the pricing structure of, say, cornflakes, all right? And you didn't realize that the actual cost of production is double the price.
Absolutely, but I think there's a path dependency issue path dependent argument here that in the past, in the 1960s or 50s, I think, there was a commission in the federal government that said that the cost sharing arrangements in higher education should be about a third, and a third, right? Private, the government, and then donations, and so on and so forth. So that's how higher education functions. It's a highly subsidized enterprise, and the reality is the conversation right now is not about moving sticker price to cost, it's to decrease cost.
Right, but I mean the point is the best way of, one thing to do is you could decrease that monster overhang. If you want to play with it, fire, no more gardens, no more,
Well, that's a different discussion.
No, but it's floating around, it's big, and I don't understand how I can handle your question without paying lots more attention to the cost question, because the best way, you want to have a cheap university? No more gardens, no more psych wards, none of that
It's
stuff,
actually
right?
the tenured faculty that are the expensive.
Are they?
Yes.
No,
Yes.
I'm not so sure of that, because do we
Somebody
know
said-
that the tenured faculty salaries are the major expense?
One of the major expenses, yes.
In what fraction?
It's huge.
Huge.
Yes, I know, but
It's
what
huge.
fraction?
I don't know exactly right now, but it's way over 40%.
All right, and, all right, that I'm willing to believe, but because I figured that the real estate and all this other stuff and the
And
bureaucracy.
a lot of the fluff, like you're talking about, the
I don't
fancy
have the
stuff,
stuff, yeah.
comes from auxiliary enterprises. So basically housing has the fancy houses, but they charge people for that. So a lot of that
Those
is not.
generate revenue.
What?
Go ahead.
Those generate revenue, that
Do
housing.
they generate
Yeah.
net revenue?
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
Bookstore, all of that generates revenue.
All of that, yeah.
I've always wondered whether they really generated real net revenue.
Yeah.
That's
They do, yeah.
All right, so
It's
you
the
have-
educational.
But the cost, yes, fine, so you have all these other stuff, but you're telling me the cost of giving you an education is large compared to what
Yes.
you're paying no matter what.
Yes, and like I alluded to in the beginning,
Sorry,
there's.
I'm stopping.
there's
So
a-
why? Here's my thing though. I don't know that that's all that relevant to our question, which is a question of political science and public administration in terms of what we're trying to understand is the finding that the weak governance structure seems to have a differential effect, and what I really think is the interesting part is not the higher education finance part, but the part about the governance and how we arrange the market for public higher education in the states seems to impact their response to state funding. So one idea is that if you have weak governance, it allows for a more effective marketplace. And you're finding that those public universities in states with weak governance are cutting their net tuition suggests that the marketplace works in the way that we want it to work, which is the way opposite of what Bennett thinks is happening. And so what it's saying is that there is a governance dimension to higher education finance, which generally is not thought about.
However, I would make the case that that affects the ability of state governments and the federal to carry out higher ed policy in general, right? Because
Sure.
I mean, you cut a little bit of the mechanisms, and then again, I mean, I'm not making a statement one way or another, but as a political scientist, there are some concerns there. I mean, we're putting all this money through financial aid and appropriations and losing a whole lot of control over what goes on inside universities.
Sure, but there's also been a lot of activity on the front of like fragmentation of state higher education. So in New Jersey, Chris Christie has made a big move to consolidate the
Yeah.
university system. And one potential, so if we're suggesting that actually we need there to be a rich public marketplace, and I don't know if you measure fragmentation of the university system, but it could be that what we're saying is that we need there to be a marketplace within the public system to prevent this Bennett effect or to work in the opposite direction of the Bennett effect. So that's what I find most interesting in this.
You know, David, it's the same, works the same with me. I think I'm more interested in the kind of things that you're talking about with respect to these boards versus the consolidated versus coordinated. Because I don't know the institutions well enough, but that is a striking difference. And it's beyond it being a striking difference. If the consolidated governing boards, I guess what you're hand waving over in the presentation is what it means for it to be a strong governance structure. I think, so could you talk a little bit more about what the difference between a consolidating board and a coordinating board would be? What kinds of things are possible for coordinated boards and not?
The majority, tuition setting authority may or may not be the case, but the majority, you have tuition setting authority.
So what if, that's the kind of thing that I guess I don't get. What does it mean to set the tuition? We make the final decision, no,
Yes.
there's no appeal, the
The
legislature.
sticker price, then the institutions can kind of, package.
So
for
it's just like we
students.
got in Georgia, exactly.
Exactly.
You
They
can't get your
package, you
tuition.
can get your
I-
tuition, you don't increase it, it's it. And the other part
And
is,
it's
for
a commitment
example,
from the legislature, so
I
the
mean,
legislature.
another
can
things that they
too.
do, for example, is everybody wants to be prestigious, do research, have great departments, so duplication. Having a public policy school in every university in the state, you can't do that. Or different kinds of departments, or tell that you need to consolidate, which it has been happening in Washington, where departments are being, obviously more humanities and arts. They're basically being cut, and people have to find another way for employment. But the reality is that even comprehensive universities, which in our case in California is the Cal States, there's a pressure to do more research, bring grants. So there is kind of, so my biggest concern here beyond what we talked about is this issue of coordination, right? So if you decentralize, okay, market forces may be working, but some other mechanism in place, because individual behavior is leading to a whole set of inefficient, if that's a good word to use, outcomes and ineffectiveness.
There are coordination problems for the coordinating boards that
Yes.
don't exist for consolidation boards. In terms of, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a really interesting difference in this setting. I think you've got a nice area to study.
And the target journal for this early on was EPA, right? Education Evaluation and Policy Analysis. That's why the focus is much more on the economics of ed here. But now I think it's become clear to us that we're either going to go to a higher ed journal or a public policy journal, that then we will be able to explore these things. Because if you read economist articles, they're not going to, too much explanation on these things, not going to go. Yeah, it's more about our instrument. So what we got hit on was the instrument, right? Yeah.
One of the problems with studying this is that there are so many variables, so many
Yes.
things beyond your control, beyond your ability to measure and estimate the effect of. I wonder if you could get at the underlying question of how does the institutional, or what is it that you call it, the institutional versus the state? So the state control versus the institution control, if you could model that problem at a single institution where the central authority sets a certain policy, but then individual units within the colleges and schools have their own autonomy to make decisions about financial aid that are different from. So say the university makes a decision for everybody about what the tuition level will be. we're gonna have 6% increase this year. How did the individual units react to that? And what are the factors that influence whether they all have the same sticker price, but how much do they engage in discounting across the units? How do they react to the sticker price increase?
Well, from my experience, most units don't, unless they are the financial officer or the dean or the department chair, nobody cares. I mean, it's...
But I understand, for example, the higher tuition.
No, I'm saying that, you know, it actually simplifies if you're doing research, because then you can go to...
But the deans do set those financial aid budgets, and to some...
in most universities, we have a director of financial aid, what we call these days enrollment management office. And they're the ones that, so basically have graduate education, so most of the time we're talking undergraduate education, right? Because graduate education is highly subsidized by undergraduate education, but also by federal grants, research, and so on and so forth. So for the undergraduate education, usually the enrollment management office, that sometimes is under the chief financial officer of the university, sometimes under the chief academic officer, they're the ones that are making these
That's
decisions.
right, so the bulk of the aid is distributed centrally.
Yeah.
But units do also have their own funds. I imagine this varies from place to place, but speaking of USC, individual units do have their
For
own scholarship
undergraduates?
funds for undergraduates
Okay.
that they can
Do they?
make decisions about. And indeed,
But-
you can raise money, you can make it a priority to raise money for that or not. And certainly at the master's degree level, where there's both, it's subsidized. Some
Yes.
people pay full price, some people get a
We call
discount.
master's degrees cash cows. Yeah.
Yeah.
So best is, you know, these special professional ones, because people pay full price for them, and usually there is very little financial aid. But what you're speaking about, at least the way I understand it, even if the department raises money for scholarships, it's funneled through the financial aid office. So what could happen is kind of a crowding out effect, that if a student gets an extra scholarship, for example, there's more money for somebody else to do something else. So these are highly sophisticated enterprises that are using optimization techniques, you know, to try to get just the right price and the right package, you know, to get the student there at the university and close the, yes.
So I had a question that I think just generally relates to maybe variable bias. So I'm wondering to what extent you think it is the governance structure itself being strong or weak, and that's having a causal effect, versus the extent to which different types of states choose different governance structures. These aren't exogenously given, and so that the type of states that choose centralized government structures are just fundamentally different when it comes to the preferences of the state legislature or what they're looking for out of their higher education institutions.
Absolutely. So and now the venue has changed for our paper. I definitely think that I need to bring in demographic variables for the state and some measures of state government preferences. They don't change often, the governance structures, but you're absolutely right. There's some level of endogeneity going on here that I would have to include, and I already have a lot of these variables for us to include in the model.
I mean, just do we think there's something strange about states where they don't trust their higher education institutions, right? So
that's
that's like
common.
Florida and Georgia. So Florida doesn't trust its universities. It wants to
No.
starve the beast. Its
Yeah.
preference is not to give more financial aid and to have students pay less. Its preference is less spending on education, period. They fundamentally believe that the University of Florida could spend less if they weren't so concerned with being academics. You know, if they would just be more efficient.
But then you have the effect like here, you know, in California, where even if people, it's the issue of priorities and preferences, right? The preferences are to support universities, but it's not a priority, right? So it could be a trust there, but there's a big difference there between the two. So, thank you. This is.
Well, anyway, thank you very much.